The place, somewhere in America. The time, the late 1930s. The band leader, Benny Goodman. The music, Sing, 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 composed by Louis Prima. The soloist, Harry James on his trumpet. The drummer, Gene Krupa. And suddenly, somebody from the crowd let out a whooping shout.
So, this was the swing era of jazz. The swing era was the era of the big bands, the era of the music that set the dancers' feet tapping. It was the most popular era in the history of jazz.
Benny Goodman, the band leader, who first made big band jazz popular, is recorded to have said, "The first big roar from the crowd was one of the sweetest sounds I have ever heard in my life."
Well, the roar continued in the 30s till the World War II. For almost a decade, America swung to the tunes blown out by the famous jazz bands. These jazz bands toured the length and the breadth of the country. Every college prom wanted one, you see.
When New Orleans jazz was planted into Chicago towards the beginning of the century, a jazz band never had more than 8 instruments.
The brilliance of a performance of a band would depend on the improvisational abilities of the soloist.
And all these brilliant soloists like King Oliver, Louis Armstrong were instinctive musicians.
They came from the back alleys and gin mills of New Orleans. They were untutored, and their mastery over their instruments entirely self-taught.
But in New York lived an alto saxophonist called Don Redman, who had studied at 2 conservatories. In 1923, Redman was the first musician to weave in jazz ideas into a 10-piece band led by Fletcher Henderson.
Don Redman introduced methods that would keep the order in a big band, and yet give the soloist the freedom to improvise.
For instance, a trumpet piece that would normally have been a solo was harmonized for 3 trumpets. A melody was broken up by call and response exchanges between the brass and the reeds. Short, repeated ensemble patterns or riffs were written to back up the free flights of the soloist.
Thus, the rudiments of jazz arrangements began to emerge. As bands became bigger, the improvisations of the soloists got restricted.
Perhaps it was the tension between freedom and structure played out on the expansive canvas of big band that made swing such an all-encompassing phenomenon. Written arrangements became a necessity. Musicians were expected to read and write music.
It is said that when Louis Armstrong joined Fletcher Henderson's band in 1924, he was rebuked for blasting right through the passage that was marked PP, very soft.
PP? Armstrong glanced at the mystifying notation. I thought that meant pound plenty.
On joining Fletcher Henderson's band, Armstrong left his indelible mark on big band jazz. Before Armstrong came in, the arrangements used to sound thin and pallid, quite unlike jazz.
Armstrong gave the band their first brush with the soaring, freewheeling style, so characteristic of jazz.
I have in my collection a number called Dicty Blues, played by the Fletcher Henderson Band in 1923. This is before Armstrong joined the band. The tenor saxophone solo is by young Coleman Hawkins. And now, here's a number, Copenhagen, by the Henderson Orchestra the year after, when Armstrong joins them. The trumpet solo is by Armstrong, of course. Particularly remarkable was the transformation of Coleman Hawkins, the tenor saxophonist of the band, who was strongly influenced by Armstrong.
After the successful experiment with Henderson's big band jazz, others were also inspired to explore this new territory.
The swing era was one of the few periods in jazz history with a wide popular appeal, although in this era much of the music was not improvised. To a large extent, popularity of the swing era was due to arrangements based on popular songs. Who is generally considered as the king of swing, used to buy arrangements from Henderson. These were based on popular tunes, and Goodman's band played them with glittering precision. The amount of improvisation in most swing-era hits was small, sometimes being only 16 measures, rarely more than 32 bars.
Swing also gave birth to a new phenomenon with far-reaching consequences. A new record market sprang up overnight, directed at teenagers. Suddenly, swing became big business. It also brought about certain social changes in America. The split between youth and age now widened to an unbridgeable gap. Young America severed all ties of music, dance, and taste they once may have shared with their elders.
Duke Ellington, a band leader and pianist from Harlem, New York, emerged as the single most creative and prolific composer-arranger.
Ellington used his band as a collection of sounds. He composed his pieces with his individual musicians in mind. Their style of playing was an integral part of their composition. For instance, here's a piece built around his growled trumpeter of the day, Bubba Miley, and the piece is East St. Louis Toodaloo, which was his theme during that era. Next, you'll hear a piece Ellington built around his sweet trumpeter, Artie Wetzel, blending with clarinetist Barney Bigard and trombonist Tricky Sam Nanton to create the evergreen Mood Indigo. Ellington even went to the extent of using wordless vocals to add a new dimension to his orchestral colors. Here's singer Adelaide Hall with Ellington in 1927, the piece Creole Love Call.
Ellington's characteristic style was that he wrote passages to be played by combinations of instruments drawn from the different sections of the band, and this is called voicing or scoring across sections.
Now, in big band harmony, we have what we call harmonic density. This was divided in sections like the trumpet section, the sax section, the trombone section, and the rhythm section. During a swing tune, if the trumpets were stating the theme, a counter melody was played by the saxes and also the trombones. And when these were all put together, it sounded very interesting.
Duke Ellington was once hailed as America's only original musical mind.
Ellington even assigned melody statements to the string bass and brought it out of its confinement as a rhythmic servant.
This theme, incidentally, was used as the signature tune by Voice of America's Jazz Hour.
This is the Voice of America Jazz Hour.
Willis Conover was much more than a broadcaster. He was an institution for over 4 decades. He was one of the main reasons why people like me and a million of other people all over the world like me got into jazz. Musicians all over the world gleaned from the music they heard from his broadcasts.
While Duke Ellington dominated the jazz scene till his death in 1974 by his scintillating originality, another band leader, Count Basie from Kansas City, started growing in popularity in the 1930s.
Basie's band represented the essence of swing more than any other band of the day. Performances of his band were relaxed and conveyed a feeling of ease. His rhythm section rolled on as subtly and propulsively as though it were on ball-bearing wheels. His famous rhythm section consisted of Basie himself on piano, Freddie Green on the rhythm guitar, Walter Page on string bass, and Joe Jones on drums. This group was noted for achieving a balance among the sounds of each member. The 4 parts were smoothly integrated. Their renderings were carefully controlled to avoid disturbing the evenness and balance of sound. Even as a solo pianist, Basie barely made his presence felt. He often played through an entire selection with just a few interjections during dramatic silences. He artfully used silence to pace his lines.
The Basie Band was basically an amalgamation of small band approach with big band projection. Whereas Ellington's arrangements were built around his individual soloists, Count Basie used head arrangements. That is, the basic pattern was laid out from before and discussed, and then the soloists came on as and when they could. This was because the musicians were basically poor readers. In effect, any solo by a member of the Ellington band was well integrated into the piece and could not be separated from the whole. Whereas in Basie's case, the extensive solos could be separated from the whole and form separate pieces by themselves.
Even while it capped the swing era, Basie's band was pointing in the direction of things to come. The crest was on with the experimenters.
Hundreds of improvising musicians were employed in the swing era bands, some of whom were to change things for good. Lester Young, in Count Basie's band, was a brilliant tenor saxophonist with revolutionary ideas. His music pointed to the future and what was to become modern jazz.
Charlie Christian, an electric guitarist in Benny Goodman's band, was another pioneer in his own way.
During the late 30s, a guitarist called Charlie Christian joined Benny Goodman's group. Charlie Christian changed the entire concept of the guitar and also an entire concept of jazz, introducing what later became Bebop. Christian eliminated the 4/4 strumming of the guitar and introduced a subtler form of comping chords, which was not, of course, called comping. Comping meant that instead of playing 4 to the bar, you jot chords melodically. When I came across an old 78 record of the Benny Goodman Sextet, which featured Charlie Christian on it, I subconsciously heard this record playing and then heard a guitarist just play a brief solo and vanish. This intrigued me to such an extent that I decided that this should be my future goal of playing the guitar. And therefore it has been ever since.
These musicians were ultimately responsible for taking jazz forward to its more complex and evolved form, the bebop.
The big band era was short-lived. During the depressions in America, it was not possible to sustain big bands, so eventually the bands shrunk in size. But today, again, some daring experiments are tried with big bands. Perhaps some new form of music will emerge from this cacophonic mess-up.